By 7 a.m., as the nationwide invasion was in complete and total full swing, as the coalition forces were now vying for absolute control over every single solitary major city, large towns along key invasion routes, as well as critical infrastructure which ranged from the industrial to transportation and even to the power generating capabilities, as well as also the sewage and water treatment centers. Political sites were also major objectives for the Sino-Russian coalition forces, but most of all were the military installations and units that happened to be already deployed in the field and were now being fully engaged within the scope of this gargantuan invasion. As by this point in time, the juxtaposition of the combat within the tight confined spaces of urban terrain with the wide open spaces as it related to rural terrain was striking, as within these urban confined spaces, maneuver space was at a premium for the various forces engaging in the combat. However, the Sino-Russian coalition forces were both well trained, not only in urban warfare tactics, but also in rural maneuver warfare tactics, as the urban combat was now taking on a very brutal and ugly dimension, as again the major cities were all being fought over heavily for absolute complete coalition control, as many of these cities were critical nodes along the key invasion routes, such as all of the major, medium, small cities and large towns that spanned the I-35 corridor, which was the premier invasion route of all the different invasion routes being utilized by the external invasion components. As it pertained to operations occurring in the rural hinterlands of many of these primary invasion sectors, which were in fact the first sites of the initial operations, as there were primary, secondary, and tertiary areas within the span of the nation as it pertained to the invasion and the operations taking place therein. As it pertained to the combat unfolding now in the San Antonio battle space, the Russian Second Combined Arms Army had by now, along with its allies such as the Venezuelans, Nicaraguans, and even Serbians, taken control of the entire city and the critical highway infrastructure of I-35, as well as all the additional highways which spanned the large city of San Antonio. As attached to the Second Combined Arms Army was not only its foreign allies, the Venezuelans, Nicaraguans, and Serbian forces in the primary invasion zone of San Antonio, but also another Russian element, which was the 70th Special Purposes Detachment, which itself was a Spetsnaz battalion, as this was the official name of it. It had been attached along with even Russian Air Force, or VVS, rotary aircraft in the form of a detachment of 32 Mi-35M attack/transport helo gunships for the express purpose of moving or shuttling into operations the 70th Special Purposes Detachments comprising companies, as these attack helo gunships / transport helos were the ideal platform for operations in regards to the Spetsnaz forces. They served as outstanding fire support platforms in their ongoing operations. And as the Russian 70th Special Purposes Detachment was in fact attached to the 2nd Combined Arms Army, they had now been ordered, upon their 6 of 8 combat companies taking control of Camp Bullis, along with elements of the 30th Motor Rifle Brigade, which had committed its combat engineer, armored, and 1 of its mechanized infantry battalions to capturing this site, as well as 2 mechanized infantry battalions from the 30th Motor Rifle Brigade and 3 additional Spetsnaz companies capturing Lackland. And now the last 2 remaining combat companies would be shuttled in their totality. Instead of taking 2 trips, they would be able to do it in 1 trip, as all 32 helos could now be redirected for the operations to occur in the Government Canyon State Park, which was outside of the large urban sprawl that was San Antonio, as thousands of armed civilians that opted not to be reactionary for the most part, but to get out of the city, which was an exceedingly wise decision, although many of them moved into the nearby Government Canyon State Park, and thus would be hunted down vigorously of these special purposes, along with their attack / transport helo gunships operating alongside of them in a 2-day-long long-range reconnaissance and patrol operation, wherein they would utilize their quadcopter assets in conjunction with the high-altitude drones, as the Russian 4-post high-altitude recon drones and the Chinese high-altitude and armed CH-4A recon drones operating in this particular theater of operations within the South Central Invasion sector as it pertained to San Antonio. As now these companies of elite troops were already, by this point, at 7 a.m. shuttled into the Government Canyon State Park. They thus had already begun a series of foot patrols through the area, breaking up into platoon-sized elements from these 2 comprising companies, and again would patrol the area for 2 full days within the scope of the entire 4-day-long invasion. As in, they would only complete this operation on day 3 by 7 a.m. in the morning, and would actually camp out for a night in the Government Canyon State Park and have a roving and stationary guard roster, as they would take turns on guard duty to guard their campsites. As the Serbian forces of the Serbian Army's 1st Brigade, under the command of the Russian 2nd Combined Arms Army, were conducting their own operations, as they were well within striking distance of not only the New Braunfels city, which was 34 miles from San Antonio, but also even the city of Kyle, which was just under 60 miles away, as the CCP regime properties upon which all of these battalions had been posted were stocked to the brim of supplies and logistical capability to carry out these operations, which were, again, within merely dozens of miles, as this would be easy to sustain vehicle loads of supplies to the Serbian combat forces of 3 different battalions from the brigade chosen to carry out this operation. They would send their lone combat engineer battalion. They would also send their armored battalion and 1 of their mechanized infantry battalions, with heavy support from their own 152mm Nora B battalion of artillery, as well as also their Morava rocket artillery battalion. They would have high-altitude recon drone support from the Chinese, with a CH-4A being sent to the north and slightly east to support the Serbian operations, with outstanding ISR capabilities and even ATGM support if and when needed, as well as also returning coalition aircraft, as the aircraft that had done their RTB to Mexico were now beginning to return to the area, as the J-11 fighter squadron, now heavily armed with air-to-ground munitions instead of air-to-air munitions, such as was their first sortie, as well as also the J-16 fighter squadron returning with more air-to-ground munitions as well, and of course the two JH-7 squadrons returning with their full combat loads of nearly 20,000 square pounds of air-to-ground ordnance, as now the last operation taking place within the primary invasion sector, as these forces were now preparing to push out and into secondary areas. The Government Canyon operation, again, would be carried out for 2 days and would be going on concurrently. The Serbian operation, which by now was already in full swing, as the 3 chosen battalions from the brigade to carry out the operation with their artillery and even Chinese air and ISR support were moving into the New Braunfels area under the absolute command of the 2nd Combined Arms Army, as his 91st Headquarters Brigade contained its HHB, which were the administrative and command elements of the entire massive 2nd Combined Arms Army, which was stretched from San Antonio to Austin and even into Fort Hood, participating in that battle with the Chinese PLA's reserve 68th Group Army, of the PLA. As these Serbian forces were now moving into the New Braunfels area, the long-range reconnaissance and patrol operations were now well underway in the Government Canyon State Park. As we go to the map of a small portion of the state park, which was very many square miles in its absolute size, this was a very large area, and there were cave complexes, as this was at the base of the Edwards Plateau, which was also mentioned in the Austin battle occurring to the north of the San Antonio battle, as the Edwards Plateau extended along many cities and towns that effectively were on I-35 from San Antonio and northwards, even close to Fort Hood. As in this particular area of the map of the overall large state park area, the troops had just been inserted into the area by their attack/transport helo gunships, the Mi-35Ms, having had fast-roped these troops into this very wooded and hilly terrain. The helos would linger in the area to provide them with flying support in the form of ATGMs, 80mm rockets, the S-8s, on 40 on each side, on each pod, as well as also 23mm firepower from the nose cannon mounted on the front of the Mi-35Ms. These were very capable and effective gunships, and the fact that they could transport a squad apiece into battle made them exceedingly popular for these types of operations among the Spetsnaz forces, as they were now covering their troops after they landed. They would linger in the area as long as possible until having to return for fuel and or any needed maintenance before returning back to the Government Canyon area to continue supporting these forces during their long-range reconnaissance and patrol activities, as the lower-level quadcopter assets deployed by these two companies would radio in the exact coordinates for artillery strikes among any armed reactionary civilian elements seen coming out to challenge them, as in reacting to these forces. They would be imminently destroyed, as the entire battalion could now focus all of its efforts from the 30th Motor Rifle Brigade's own artillery battalion on assisting the Spetsnaz troops in Government Canyon, as well as the coalition air support being split between supporting the Spetsnaz operations among the PLAAF strike aircraft and fighters, which were now armed with air-to-ground munitions predominantly, although maintaining 2 missiles that were air-to-air missiles for self-defense, although it was only SOP to do this, as the USAF effectively ceased to exist by this point in time, as it had been thoroughly, completely destroyed by 5 a.m. on day 1, meaning every aspect of the USAF was now completely eradicated and gone, and no longer any type of factor whatsoever at all in the course of this invasion for the rest of the 4-day invasion. As now, these aircraft would also be flying precision strike operations on the very same targets that would be sighted by the quadcopter assets, as would also be struck by artillery, as the Russian 2S-19 MSTA self-propelled 152mm howitzers would orient their battalion and all of their comprising howitzers towards the Government Canyon State Park and fire in support of their Spetsnaz troops that were on the ground from the 70th Special Purposes Detachment. And these forces were not only armed with standard small arms, but they also came with their devastating FPV drone capabilities, which were not only devastating against troops, but also against vehicles, as these could destroy tanks, as have been done many times in recent history in the Great Eastern European proxy conflict and even in combat in the Middle East. As this Spetsnaz soldier is operating this FPV drone, it's being flown to strike clusters of armed reactionary civilian infantry type forces, as effectively that's what they would be in terms of the battlefield and the situation as it was evolving. As they came with weapons like their general purpose PKM machine guns, they also had light machine guns like RPK-74s and their standard AK-74M rifles. Some even carried the AK-74SU, as it was very compact and light, but most, as they had their pick of small arms, opted to carry the AK-74M, as it had better accuracy over longer ranges than did the more compact AK-74SU. As they also carried in their RPG-7s for the same reason. They were lighter and more compact than the newer RPG types, which were a bit larger and more cumbersome. These weapons were an excellent choice of weapon with their anti-personnel rounds, as they were devastating on clusters of infantry-type forces. And in this situation, there were very few, if any, vehicles in use by the armed reactionary civilian elements, as they presented themselves as large targets, as they would be finding out throughout the course of this long-range reconnaissance and patrol operation, as they would be discovered by the Russian quadcopter assets, as well as high-altitude assets and satellite, all overlaying to form a complete picture of the fluid, ever-changing modern battlefield, adding and removing enemy icons of any enemies that were sighted. Anytime they would be destroyed, they would be removed from the combat data links carried by the squad-level NCOs of each and every Spetsnaz squad, as they had combat data link and radio access to communicate with one another, as they could communicate through the real-time AI battlefield data processing system through their combat data links, as well as also utilizing radio as a means of backup communications, as well as inter-squad communications, which is mostly what the radio would end up being used as. As the attack helo gunships, also monitoring the real-time AI battlefield data processing system, would be guided on where to put down ATGMs on target, as well as also 23mm fire, which was absolutely devastating, especially on clusters of infantry, as well as also their S8 80mm rocket fires, which were also exceedingly destructive, as well as also the shelling coming in from the Russian artillery of the 30th Motor Rifle Brigade's Artillery Battalion of the 2S-19 MSTA howitzers, as all of the coordinates would be sent in directly for artillery strikes, as they would hit these forces and wooded areas as well as out in the open, and even within the openings of certain caves if they could be spotted therein, as well as also the devastating FPV drones, which were utilized to great effect, as well as also the tactical superiority and fighting prowess of these elite Spetsnaz troops, all of which combined with the airstrikes to make an absolutely devastating scene of total, absolute destruction. As the different valleys within this hilly terrain, which was the Government Canyon State Park, as it was also, again, well wooded, it was also fall, and in this time of year, many of the trees had molted their leaves, although there were still plenty of coniferous trees like juniper, which actually disguised IR signatures if the personnel were absolutely still within these types of wooded areas, as well as other types of evergreen plant matter and foliage that was still remaining within these wooded areas. Again, if the armed reactionary civilians that tried to challenge the Spetsnaz were among the more knowledgeable, they were able to utilize some of these types of naturally occurring phenomena like the plant matter to their best advantage when combating these Spetsnaz forces. Although again, these were very elite forces of these two Spetsnaz companies who had absolute total gunship support from their own attack helos of the Russian VVS or Air Force. They had FPV drones, which were devastating. They were experts in tactical formations and fighting. They were also able to call in artillery strikes through their ISR dominance and precision airstrikes on their targets. As in, combating the Spetsnaz for armed reactionary civilian elements was almost inviting death on every turn, as these were still at this point mostly leaderless elements of armed reactionary civilians, although again, there were some militia type elements that were scattered throughout the hinterlands of the large cities like Austin and San Antonio, but for the most part, many of these armed civilians that ended up having to become reactionary, as in reacting to the Spetsnaz presence in the state park, would mostly be leaderless, lack any type of logistical assets to sustain any type of operations against the occupation forces, at least for the time being, this was the case. And these Spetsnaz troops, again, who were more heavily armed, they had attack helo support, they had air support and artillery support, as well as ISR dominance, would be exceedingly difficult to contend with, as they made their landing a bit earlier and begun their patrols throughout the map. The loitering munition support that was even offered was coming from nearby units, such as the headquarters battalion of the 30th Motor Rifle Brigade, which, like the 70th Special Purposes Detachment, sat to the south and outside of the Government Canyon State Park, and they did have their combat drone company within this headquarters battalion over the entire brigade, and their company was able to fire ample numbers of loitering munitions throughout the course of this sustained two-day-long operation, as the helos could also bring in logistical resupply operations in terms of ammunition, MREs, water, anything the troops on the ground needed, they could also do so as well, making them an outstanding platform again for these operations. As all of this brown indicates wooded areas, this is elevation and terrain. There were valleys in this area. There was also tributaries like so that flowed through the area. The terrain, again, was quite diverse in terms of comparing this area to the more urbanized combat that was occurring throughout the invasion. There were many more hiding places within this terrain, as again, it was full of all types of cave systems as well as coniferous plant matter, which, again, could be taken advantage of by the more wise among the armed reactionary civilian elements. But as the total ISR dominance was able to pinpoint many of these forces with small arms fire, with attack helo gunship support as well. These forces were eradicated immediately right here as this platoon moved in from one of the companies. This was a separate platoon from the same company as this platoon, and this was the third platoon of this same company. Again, there were two companies. There was another one operating off the map and to the south, outside of this area, as they landed in the middle of Government Canyon and went in two different directions to sweep the area on their long-range reconnaissance and patrols. And as they bounded and covered tactically through the area, they would engage these forces with 23mm fire from their attack helos. They would also be firing Ataka ATGMs at targets that were further off in the distance. As this area, north to south, was a 1.5 mile area by 2 miles east to west. This was a large area within an even larger state park in its totality. And as these forces were moving through the area vigorously, anytime their ISR quadcopter assets spotted movement, they called in for gunship support, as well as the loitering munitions that were in the area operating on their AI target-seeking modes, which also went through the real-time AI battlefield data processing network that was connected to the ISR grid. It monitored everything about it, as well as also connecting to the combat data links, which updated in real time all the relevant information back to these forces, who were now tactically bounding and covering together through this area and engaging armed reactionary elements anytime they appeared. This attack helo would move in to pick up wounded among this platoon, which by the time it moved through this area, as these were firing their S-8 rockets at targets off the map, these two gunships right here, as well as 23mm fire to cover the movement of this platoon through the valley tactically, as well as also loitering munitions, the Lancet 3s that were in this area, as well as Ataka missile fire, artillery fire, and FPV drones that were launched against this element that by the time they moved into this area and then coordinated their actions with an entirely different group moving through this valley by the time they made contact, they tried to coordinate their actions against this platoon, which was moving in staggered column formations led by a wedge formation of a Russian Spetsnaz squad. These were all the squads that comprised the platoon, all 5. And as they moved through the area, they broke off to bound and cover and coordinate their actions together, this squad even getting up on higher ground and firing down at these personnel using their quadcopter assets to call in imminent Russian artillery strikes by the time these forces moved into the area, and they were both laying down heavy fire on one another, including these armed reactionary civilians that now tried to coordinate their actions together, but they were now hit by 4 FPV drones that were launched against them, as well as all of the hefty Spetsnaz fire being laid down by their troops, mostly in the prone position and very few in the kneeling position behind large rocks or other cover they could find if the terrain was sloping in such a way that they could get behind it, like right here. They used the terrain to their advantage in their firefights, and as the attack helo gunships fired Ataka missiles at these forces and artillery shelling came in the form of sustained 155mm shell fire that repeatedly hit these sites right here where these imminent strike markers indicate these shells landed. Repeated shells were launched into this area as the fire mission that was relayed back by the real-time AI battlefield data processing system, which was putting together the pre-made strike packages for the FDCs of the Russian artillery forces to send down to the gun lines, ensured that the fire was sustained to wipe out all of these armed reactionary civilians reacting to the sighting of the invasion forces, with loitering munition strikes, FPV drone strikes, Ataka ATGM strikes, rocket fire, which initiated upon this combat occurring right here, as these two were firing their S-8 80mm rocket pods at these forces as they were high up and they could fire down upon them, as well as 23mm fire from their nose-mounted autocannons. This was absolutely devastating, with the small arms fire that was vectored into them from all these squads, including this squad that made it up to higher ground and fired down upon them as the artillery came in and hit in this general area, along with the FPV drone strikes, the small arms fire, including from this squad that managed to get on higher ground, which was an advantageous position, with the Ataka ATGM fire coming in, S8 80mm rocket fire. It was devastating, with 23mm fire as well. All of these forces, which numbered in excess of 180 between both of these groups, each of these groups being approximately half of that number, about 90 and about 90. This is what 90 people looks like in each area. This grouping up here moved further away and out of the area, but would be engaged later by air, artillery, loitering munitions, and more, as the Spetsnaz would continue pursuing these forces and others trying to flee. These would be hit by artillery as they saw this incoming airstrike, where this JH-7 is literally dropping 12,000 pounds of ordnance on these forces right here, where this was another large grouping of forces. This, in its absolute total, was about 100 forces moving into this area, and they were all hit as they were spread out by the spread out free fall munitions dropped by the very powerful heavy-hitting JH-7 strike aircraft, which was sent the data and coordinates for the strike from the real-time AI battlefield data processing system to support their Russian allies in this battle. Also, there were J-11s operating in the area as well as J-16s, as there was a J-11 on this particular map that was moving through the area but much further away, had fired 4 standoff air-to-ground cruise missiles, KD-88s, which had a range of over 100 miles, and as this was fired much closer to their targets, they moved through the state park to hit targets in its far northwest corner as they were firing these 4 air-to-ground cruise missiles. And again, they had fired them from further off the map, from when they were just outside of the Government Canyon area, and they were just passing through the area after long since the missiles had been fired, as it was flying through the area at an exceedingly high rate of speed, as were these 2 JH-7s, which conducted dive attacks with free fall ordnance, as they had these munitions on special racks that would give them a decent spread while still maintaining a high degree of accuracy in a dive strike, as they could also carry precision munitions, obviously, such as laser guided and even Baidu or satellite guided effectively as well. They were mostly using free fall munitions due to the spread out nature of the environment and the combat, and the thousands of armed civilians that had taken to this area as a refuge. Again, as the 2-day operation would unfold with the turn of VVS or rotary aircraft, the Chinese air sorties would also remain a constant, as well as the air power was now divvied up between supporting the 70th Special Purposes Detachment's 2 deployed companies in this area, as well as also the large operation occurring against New Braunfels, where 3 Serbian battalions, supported by 2 of their artillery battalions, their rocket and their howitzer battalion, as well as Chinese air power and also their ISR capabilities. The air power was immense that was deployed to the San Antonio battlespace alone, as 2 fighter squadrons and 2 strike aircraft squadrons in such a small area was a large deployment of aircraft within a mere 50 by 40 mile area. And now that the forces were expanding into secondary areas, as well as cleaning up what remained of any resistance within the San Antonio primary area, the air power, even split between these 2 operations, was simply immense, as the very powerful heavy-hitting JH-7s, now augmented by their fighter aircraft like the J-11s And the J-16s, which, although being a completely and totally different aircraft, as it had a shortened airframe and had more advanced features than even the very advanced J-11, were now both the two fighter squadrons carrying predominantly air-to-ground munitions, again with only two air-to-air missiles as per SOP for self-defense, as the USAF, again, no longer existed. These now carried KD-88 standoff air-to-ground cruise missiles for airstrikes, as well as also free-fall or laser-guided, and some carried Baidu-guided or satellite-guided air-to-ground munitions for the operations now underway. As did the JH-7s, although, again, they preferred their free-fall munitions as they had a massive spread in a dive attack, but again was still accurate enough to pound the target area into complete and total ruination, as now was being done in Government Canyon, as this JH-7 is coming down this way and is dropping thousands of pounds into this valley below, as artillery is striking this ridge off in the distance, and the dropping of these thousands of pounds would absolutely devastate this valley. Massive clouds of dirt and smoke and a large shock wave from the blast would be visible from up here on this ridge, and the Russians would definitely keep their heads down as this strike would come in, as currently they were firing at other forces sighted off in another area, as this FPV drone is also being deployed to hit other armed reactionary civilian elements. Again, the combat against the Spetsnaz was effectively a death wish for the armed reactionary civilians, and again, very few of them would even be operating technicals at this time, as they presented themselves as enormous targets in such an operation, with ATVs being more commonly used at this point than were the trucks and SUVs that were being utilized as technicals. These were the ideal vehicle for such terrain, although they still would be seen and destroyed as they presented themselves as large targets, as these forces had moved through this area, bounding and covering tactically from this platoon of 5 squads, this squad making its movement here. They would fire down at these forces moving through this area, as well as their quadcopter assets linked to the real-time AI battlefield data processing system, calling in artillery strikes as Ataka ATGMs and 23mm fire were coming in to hit these forces off in the near distance. These 2 squads here would launch an FPV drone each, and as this platoon was moving through this valley into this area, their quadcopter assets had sighted these forces in addition to these squads spotting these forces, and of course they were all in constant communications through the combat data link and real-time AI battlefield data processing network, as well as radio. And this squad had sent an FPV drone to strike as well, at the same time as artillery was coming in to wipe these forces out on their ATVs, as there were 2 apiece on each ATV, and the rest of these forces following on foot. As they were moving relatively slowly, when they came in, the artillery hit with a very devastating precision effect, as these forces fired down at them from these 3 squads. And these 2 squads, having moved on the flanks after wiping these personnel out, had moved into this area to assist as well. Again, there was a medevac mission carried out by this attack helo gunship after firing its ATGM's S-8 80mm rockets from their pods, as well as also 23mm fire. They had flown into this clearing after these loitering munitions had passed and hit these forces, in conjunction with all of the shelling that came in, the FPV drones and small arms fire, including from this squad up here, now covering tactically the landing of this gunship/transport helo, as the squad maintained their positions after all the firepower had done its job and wiped out this large number of armed reactionary civilians. The wounded from this platoon, after they had their large firefight, were effectively loaded on to the Mi-35M and flown out of the area, as the Russians in this particular platoon, in their engagement, had suffered 5 WIAs, no KIAs, but their WIAs had been hit in the extremities, and although they were also hit in the body armor, which effectively did nothing, the extremities were bleeding profusely, and thus they had to be shuttled out and away to the CCP regime property, whereupon the medical battalion within the 91st Headquarters Brigade of its 2nd Combined Arms Army had their trauma treatment center for combat trauma and injuries, and they had the lead medical personnel, as in their brigade surgeons and more, to manage this state-of-the-art hospital that was underground, and the medevac close enough to this hospital that these troops could be flown in exceedingly fast to get their proper care. All those had already been utilized to medevac POWs from both Camp Bullis and Lackland and other areas to bring in the most critically wounded to be treated by the Russians, as again, POW status afforded them proper medical care, and the same went for their own troops, obviously. So they were flown in rapidly by helo and were saved as they were bleeding profusely, but they were getting trauma treatment by combat medics that also went in and were attached to these forces as they remained aboard the helos in case they needed to medevac personnel that were critically wounded in this long-range reconnaissance and patrol that was already resulting in relatively large engagements with the local armed reactionary civilian elements within this area. As these two companies were dropped in, they now were already engaged in massive firefights and discovering with their quadcopter assets enemy positions for artillery and airstrikes, even loitering munition strikes from the headquarters battalion over the 30th Motor Rifle Brigade, which was actually on a CCP regime property near the command elements of the 70th Special Purposes Detachment, which was a platoon which was left behind on their CCP regime property as a skeleton crew, but also to manage the operations of their battalion as they were under the command for the time being of the 2nd Combined Arms Army, having been attached to them for the purposes of the San Antonio battle. And now, with this long-range reconnaissance and patrol, it was their mission to patrol the area and clean up resistance on the flanks of the city for their operations pushing out of the city to hunt down other resistance elements, as this was now the priority, since the main Priority 1 and 2 objectives had already been achieved within the San Antonio battle. And now, with this platoon moving through this valley, they now got onto higher terrain after their quadcopter assets had called in artillery strikes on this element that split up and went in different directions, with very few actually escaping the area alive, only to be hunted down later. They would hold their position on this high ground after the enormous shelling and would then comb the area for survival thereafter. As this precision airstrike came in, all of these forces were absolutely annihilated by the massive Chinese JH-7 strike here, as well as the strike here with the munitions spread out and impacting a wide area, destroying these forces, as the encapsulated green and red means they were completely destroyed, whereas a partially red or blue on a green arrow or vice versa means that they were only being engaged and possibly wounded, possibly not. But in this case, they were all devastated by the widespread of these 1,000-pound munitions that were dropped on these forces in this area. As these forces were moving through this valley, they too were also spotted by the Russian quadcopter, and also even the four-post high-altitude recon drone spotted movement once they had left an area filled with juniper trees and walked into a clearing. They were immediately struck by 152 millimeter shells from the 30th Motor Rifle Brigade's artillery battalion of the 2S-19 MSTA howitzers. As the operations were going smoothly thus far, minus a very small number of wounded among the Spetsnaz troops, they were now actively clearing a relatively large segment of the Government Canyon State Park and would conduct these operations again for 2 full days, moving through the valleys, combing the high ground for any and all resistance forces. Again, although they would destroy a few thousand armed reactionary civilian elements throughout the course of the 2-day operation, there would be small numbers of them that would survive, as in an additional 1,500 that would find cave complexes that not even the forces of the coalition were aware of, and would remain hidden therein until the Russians completed their 2-day operation within this 4-day invasion. As, again, some forces would manage to flee for the meantime, they would be most likely intercepted and destroyed at a later time, as this area was now being thoroughly cleared of any and all armed resistance, as all of these forces had been wiped out by a combination, again, of Russian shelling from their artillery forces, which were, again, very powerful. They even had the entire 385th Guards artillery to call upon if needed, but it wasn't necessary, as the single howitzer battalion of the 30th Motor Rifle Brigade, which was relatively nearby, was more than enough firepower with the Chinese air power to do in thousands of these armed civilians that were roaming the area, many of them aimlessly, as even though they were locals, many did not know the terrain all that well, as they had fled from urban terrain, which they were far more used to, although many others in San Antonio had gone into the city's labyrinth of sewers and would begin armed resistance from those areas. For the time being, San Antonio was quiet and under complete total occupation and coalition control, and now that the Spetsnaz was patrolling this area in their long-range recon and patrol operations, finding targets to be destroyed by artillery and air power, as well as also engaging them themselves, as well as their attack helo gunship firepower, which itself was impressive, they, after 2 days, would effectively return for a rest and refit on their CCP regime property and prepare for other special operations wherein they would hunt down additional groups of armed resistors in secondary and tertiary areas after their brief rest and refit, as it was also being discussed with it pertaining to such operations as in doing a collaboration with the PAP's 43rd Brigade, which was operating in the San Antonio area or in the Austin area of operations, which was north of the San Antonio area of operations. As the matters evolved, the operations would take on different forms, and different groups would be targeted after the mainstay of the American defenses had been thoroughly wiped out, which was the American Armed Forces, which by now in the San Antonio battle space, they were all but eradicated, and many thousands were taken POW, not just between the destroyed air bases and Camp Bullis, what little bit were able to get out alive and surrender, but also the massive haul of prisoners of war upon capturing Fort Sam Houston without a fight. All of these POWs were processed and brought to the pre-made prisoner of war camps established by the 91st Headquarters Brigade's subordinate units, its battalions, as the 2nd Combined Arms Army was an overall command of dealing with prisoners of war as well as the entire operation as a whole. The many captured American POWs would be divvied up between the Chinese and Russians ultimately, as some would be used for forced labor and others would be sent back to either Russia or China, and some would even be given a unique opportunity to become Russian citizens for their freedom, as many would be kept for years as prisoners of war and never released by either Russia or China, except the Russians were far more lenient with their prisoners of war, as they would remain assisting the Chinese for a total of 6 months after the invasion had ended, before pulling their forces back north to their pre-agreed upon territories of the northern Canadian and also the U.S. state of Alaska and Greenland territories, as they would move to these areas upon having concluded their dealings in the lower 48, as they agreed with the Chinese to remain for 6 months. Although they had divvied up North America with China, their primary interest would then lay in those territories, as their main reason for being in the lower 48 was to help destroy the American forces of its regime, as it was the American heartland, the lower 48, and therefore the Russians had to fight in this area alongside their Chinese allies to support this objective, but again would pull north 6 months later, as they would help fight the insurgency for 6 months at least before moving again out of the lower 48 into their pre-agreed upon ceded territories within North America. As the area which they had been effectively dropped in was now clear by the ISR guided artillery, airstrikes, and even also gunship support, as well as also the ground forces of this featured company, as the other company was operating to the south, again moving in the opposite direction. They would patrol these areas vigorously for the next 2 days. There would be small scattered engagements throughout the national park for the next few days, whereas many, again, would remain hidden in the cave systems that were not fully known to the coalition, although they did have maps and their artificial intelligence sorted through various domains of data. There were some locations that even it did not know fully about, it wasn't fully aware of, as again the locals could exploit some of these mild advantages and hide themselves. They would be the basis for future partisan uprisings against the local occupation forces. But for the time being, the Russians had won, and won decisively, and would continue to patrol the Government Canyon State Park for, again, 2 full days, and very light skirmishes where and whenever they developed would be brutally put down by artillery, attack helo, and vicious air power from the PLAAF. As the Serbian forces now were also engaging in their own operations, ultimately commanded by the Russian 2nd Combined Arms Army's command elements, the Spetsnaz now were sweeping Government Canyon, as the Serbian forces were now moving into secondary areas to crush armed reactionary civilian resistance within the city of New Braunfels, to be followed by an advance on Kyle, as they would push a grouping of what ultimately would end up being 1,000 into the waiting arms of the savagely brutal People's Armed Police elements of the 43rd PAP Brigade, which was in the Austin battle space. All of this would be done before the external invasion prong of Group Armies 7 through 13 passed through the area, totally, completely, and thoroughly clearing all of their objectives as it pertained to the coalition forces. More to come in the next video installment of this 4th generation warfare hypothetical invasion documentary series of America, highlighting the 4th gen doctrines.